It began suddenly without warning. A sharp, biting gust of wind tore through the towering trees, sending leaves spiraling into the air like torn banners. The forest, once alive with the hum of insects and the gentle rustle of foliage, fell into an eerie silence. And then the sky darkened. No, not darkened. Ripped apart, as if the very heavens themselves had been torn open. The oppressive weight of the storm hung heavy in the air, an unnatural stillness preceding the onslaught. Kyle, only a year old and still learning the ways of the wild, had never seen the sky like this. Not once in his short life had he witnessed such an ominous shift, the kind of stillness that made the fur on the back of his neck bristle with instinctual dread. His fur was still soft and not yet matted by the weathered grime of a life in the wild. His mind, innocent and untrained, could only register the strange and sudden change in the air. Something was coming, something wrong. The wind howled louder, ferocious and insistent, and the dark clouds above roiled and twisted like some ancient beast stirring from its long slumber. Kale's mother, a towering figure of raw power, a protector whose strength was as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves, moved quickly, her large paws barely disturbing the underbrush. Her sharp golden eyes locked onto her young, and with a voice low and commanding, she urged Kale and his siblings toward safety. Into the cave! Now! The words were not a suggestion. They were an order, a lifeline. Her fur, a deep russet with streaks of silver, seemed to glow with an otherworldly radiance as she herded her children with the precision of a battle-hardened warrior. Each movement was measured, a direct response to the mounting threat in the sky. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity, as if the world had held its breath, and now it would exhale in fury. With no time to waste, Kale pressed against his mother's side, his heart racing. He felt his siblings close by, the warmth of their bodies providing a fleeting sense of safety. They hurried through the undergrowth, the world now a blur of rain-soaked trees and the ever louder roar of the storm building in the distance. Kyle's tiny body was unprepared for the onslaught. The wind tugged at his fur, and the heavy scent of wet earth filled his nostrils, thick and choking. He could barely keep his eyes open against the gusts that lashed at him, driving the rain into his face like tiny biting daggers. They reached the cave, small but safe. His mother ushered them inside, and they huddled together in the damp, cool shelter. The opening to the cave was narrow, providing a modicum of protection, but it did little to block out the growing intensity of the storm outside. The storm arrived with a vengeance. Rain, thick and relentless, hammered the earth in sheets, turning the ground outside the cave into a torrent of mud and water. Thunder cracked like the roar of 1,000 bears, shaking the very bones of the forest. It was as if the gods themselves had declared war on the earth, sending their wrath down in an unrelenting torrent. Kyle trembled, his small body pressed tight against his siblings. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, the fear he felt spreading like wildfire through his veins. The noise outside was deafening, thunder that rattled his very core, the relentless wind that tore through the forest with the fury of a stampede. The ground beneath their feet vibrated as though the world itself was being torn apart. But as terrifying as the storm was, it was not the wind or the rain that sent the deepest pang of fear through Kale's heart. It was the ground beneath him, the way it seemed to shift. A deafening crack split the air. Kyle's eyes went wide in terror as a blinding flash of light illuminated the sky, followed by an earth-shattering boom. A massive bolt of lightning struck a towering tree, its branches splitting with a sickening crack. The tree swayed violently, and with a roar of splintering wood it fell, crashing down toward their hiding place. The force of the impact shook the very ground, sending debris flying. The roar of the falling tree was drowned out by the shockwave of sound that followed, a monstrous crash that seemed to echo through the entire forest. Cal's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in fear. For a brief, terrible moment, it felt as though the entire world was collapsing in on him. His mother's body blocked him from the worst of the debris, but the air itself seemed to shake with the sheer force of nature's rage. In the chaos, something snapped inside Kale. His instincts took over, and before he could understand what he was doing, his tiny legs were pumping furiously, propelling him out of the cave. The wind, now a violent force, ripped at him, tearing at his fur and blinding him with the driving rain. The world was a blur of motion. Trees bent under the force of the wind, their branches whipping and snapping like fragile twigs. Cal's small paws slipped on the slick earth, his footing unsteady as he sprinted forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to shift with every step, as though the earth itself was alive, trembling with the storm's fury. He tried to find his bearings, but everything around him was chaos. Raging wind, the deafening roar of the river growing louder with each passing second, the crash of trees falling, the eerie rumble of thunder shaking the sky. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs, small and unprepared for such a battle, carried him faster than he had ever run before. Then, just as the storm seemed to swallow him whole, the ground beneath Cale gave way. His paws slipped from the wet earth, and he tumbled, helpless, down a steep incline. His heart pounded as the world spun around him, twisting, turning, a dizzying blur of rain and mud and rock. He couldn't stop himself. He couldn't regain his footing. Everything was moving too fast, too violently. The roar of the swollen river reached a deafening crescendo as Cale tumbled toward the water's edge. The river was an angry beast, its waters churning with foam, crashing over rocks and debris. It was a force that would not be stopped, a force that would swallow him whole. Cale's last memory, as the cold rush of water engulfed him, was the sound of his mother's voice, her call, distant but filled with desperation, the sound of his name like a lifeline thrown into the storm. But the river was faster than he could swim, stronger than he could fight, and in that moment, as the world drowned in a sea of darkness, Kyle was swept away. When Kyle woke, the storm had passed. The once turbulent sky had softened into a pale gray, a distant memory of the fury it had unleashed only hours before. The air felt heavy and damp, a stillness settling over the land as if it, too, was exhausted from the chaos. But as Cale blinked his eyes open and tried to rise, an unsettling realization hit him like a sharp slap in the face. He was alone. His body ached, his muscles stiff from the cold, and the river's icy current had drained him of any strength he'd once had. His fur, matted with mud, clung to his frame. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that unsettled him. It was the vast emptiness around him. His family, his mother, his siblings, were gone. The storm had torn them apart. Cal tried to rise to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him as though they had forgotten how to stand. His senses, usually sharp and alert, felt dulled in the aftermath of the storm. The world seemed different now, more foreign than it had ever been before. The trees surrounding him were unfamiliar, their bark strange, their leaves twisted and warped in ways he'd never seen. The shadows of the forest were deeper, more oppressive, and the silence that enveloped him was deafening. Not a single bird called, not a rustle of leaves stirred the air. The forest was holding its breath, waiting for something that Cale didn't understand. The gnawing hunger in his stomach was a constant companion now. It growled and twisted, reminding him that his body needed sustenance, needed something to fill the emptiness inside him. But there was nothing. His instincts told him to keep moving, to search for food, for shelter, for something familiar in this sea of unfamiliarity. But his body was weak, and his mind, disoriented by the shock of his situation, struggled to focus. As he moved slowly through the underbrush, he searched for anything that could satisfy his hunger. He scavenged what he could, bitter roots that tasted like earth and shriveled berries that left a sour aftertaste in his mouth. But it was never enough. The hunger inside him gnawed and gnawed, a constant reminder of his fragility in this new, unforgiving world. His paws were sore, his body heavy with fatigue, but he didn't stop. His instincts were still there, buried deep, ingrained in him since birth. He was a grizzly, and even at his young age, survival was in his blood. The need to keep moving, to keep searching, was an unshakable force that pushed him onward. But no matter how hard he searched, there was always a feeling of emptiness, an aching void that no amount of food or effort could fill. The forest was not his home anymore. It was a place that seemed to reject him, as if nature itself had turned its back on him. As the days passed, the weight of loneliness began to settle into Cale's bones. It was a slow, creeping thing at first, a flicker in the back of his mind that he could push aside. But the nights were the hardest. It was when the darkness closed in around him, when the cold bit into his fur and the wind howled through the trees, that the isolation became unbearable. Cal would curl up beneath a fallen log or huddle beneath the shelter of a thick pine, doing his best to protect himself from the elements. But the cold was relentless, seeping into his bones, gnawing at him from the inside out. He could feel the chill in his fur, and the comfort of warmth, of being surrounded by family, was nothing but a distant memory. The nights were long, too long. The dark stretched on for hours, and the loneliness filled every corner of his mind until there was nothing else. He missed his mother's warm embrace, the steady presence of her strength and love. She had been his protector, his guide, teaching him how to navigate the world with grace and power. He missed the playful nudges from his siblings, the comfort of their presence beside him, the way they had shared everything. They had been a pack, a unit, and now it was just Cale, just him and the vast, empty forest. But there was no one to soothe his fears now, no one to keep him company in the long, endless hours of the night. His heart ached with the loss of them, of everything he had known. He tried not to think about it, tried not to dwell on the void that stretched out before him. But sometimes when the silence was too heavy, when the weight of the loneliness became unbearable, his mind would drift back to the last moment he had seen them. His mother's desperate call as he was swept away by the river. The sound of her voice, so full of fear and love, had echoed in his mind. But now it was only a faint memory, distant and fading with each passing day. In the daytime, Kyle would move through the forest, driven by the instinct to survive. But at night, he would lie awake, staring up at the sky, trying to find the stars through the thick canopy of trees. He wondered if his family was out there somewhere, if they too had survived the storm. The thought of them, of his mother, was both a comfort and a wound. It reminded him of everything he had lost, but it also kept him going. It was the one thing that kept his heart beating through the silence. The days blurred together, each one filled with the same fruitless search for food, for shelter, for some trace of his family. He had no map, no guide to help him navigate this strange new world. All he had were his instincts, and even those seemed to falter at times. He would find himself standing in the middle of a clearing, unsure of where to go, unsure of how to proceed. His mind would race, his body would shake, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of his situation would press down on him with suffocating force. But then he would remember. He would remember that he was a grizzly, that he was born to survive. And with that, he would push forward once again. Cal had to. There was no other choice. Grizzly bear cubs, like Cale, are born into a world of fierce competition and relentless survival. These powerful creatures, with their thick fur coats and massive paws, are not born with the skills they need to thrive in the wild. Instead, grizzly bear cubs stay with their mothers for a significant portion of their early lives, typically for 2 to 3 years. During this critical time, they learn the essential survival skills they will carry with them throughout their lives. The first and most important skill they acquire is how to find food. Foraging and hunting are not innate abilities. They must be taught. Kyle's mother would have spent countless hours showing him how to identify edible plants, dig for roots, and catch fish from streams. At the same time, Kyle would have observed her as she hunted larger prey, such as moose or deer, understanding how to use his physical strength and sharp claws to catch and subdue animals. These lessons are not just about feeding, they are about learning to survive in the wilderness, where every day is a challenge. Equally important is learning how to evade predators. While adult grizzlies are apex predators, capable of defending themselves against most threats, cubs are vulnerable. In the wild, threats come in many forms, from rival bears to wolves and even humans. The presence of a mother grizzly offers some protection, but as cubs grow, they must learn to navigate the forest alone, recognizing signs of danger and knowing when to retreat and when to stand their ground. These lessons are often the difference between life and death, and they are not easily learned. Without the guidance of their mothers, young grizzly bears face tremendous odds. Only about 50% of cubs survive their first year if they are forced to navigate the world alone. The statistics are sobering. Grizzly bear cubs are highly vulnerable to a range of dangers, from starvation to predation. Without the careful instruction of their mothers, many cubs fail to thrive in the wilderness. In fact, much of a young bear's first year is about mastering survival in the face of these staggering odds. For Kyle, his journey was not just about finding food or shelter, it was a fight against these overwhelming statistics. With no mother to guide him, he had to learn the hard way. His instincts, though strong, were not enough to ensure his survival. He had to learn to adapt, to be resourceful, and to rely on whatever strength he could muster to overcome the obstacles in his path. Every day was a battle, not just against hunger and the elements, but against the forces that conspired to take his life. The forest, while beautiful and bountiful, was also unforgiving. Each step Kyle took, each new challenge he faced, was a reminder of the harshness of the world he had been thrust into. His reliance on the survival skills he'd learned in his early months was critical. Kyle had the benefit of his mother's teachings, even if they had not been as thorough as those of other cubs. And though he was alone, Kale's resilience became his greatest asset, an invaluable trait in a world where survival depended not just on strength, but on wit and persistence. But survival alone is not enough. In the wild, the relationship between a mother and her cub is crucial for more than just practical reasons. It forms the foundation of a young bear's socialization. Cubs learn about the world from their mothers and from their interactions with other bears. They form bonds that last throughout their lives, bonds that teach them the importance of cooperation and community. These lessons, learned through play, conflict, and care, help to build a bear's emotional intelligence. Without these early social interactions, Cal would be deprived of an essential component of his growth and well-being. Kyle's journey was filled with immense challenges, but it was also an opportunity to prove his worth. Each step he took, each lesson he learned, brought him closer to adulthood. Whether he was hunting, foraging, or simply navigating the vast wilderness, Kale's survival was a testament to the strength of his spirit and the knowledge he had inherited from his mother. Survival was Kale's greatest challenge, but it was also his greatest triumph. Kale's fortunes changed one morning when he heard a faint caw, a sound that broke through the heavy silence of the forest like a lifeline thrown into the dark. The wind had shifted, and in the distance, he could just make out the unmistakable caw of a raven. It was a peculiar sound, one that stirred a curiosity in him, despite the fact that food was always his top priority. There was something different about this call, a desperation in the bird's voice that caught Kale's attention. Following the sound, Kale's sharp eyes quickly picked out the dark silhouette of a raven perched upon a rock, its wings trembling and its movements sluggish. As he drew closer, he saw the cause of the bird's distress, a broken wing. The raven, whom Kale later called Shade, looked at him with wary, intelligent eyes. It was clear that the bird was just as cautious of Kale as Kale was of it. Both of them were survivors in a harsh world, and instinct told them to be suspicious of anything that could pose a threat. But hunger has a way of forging unlikely bonds, and for the first time in weeks, Kale found himself more focused on the raven's vulnerability than his own hunger. He moved closer, the natural predator in him weighing the situation carefully. He could have easily devoured the bird in a moment, but something inside him paused. He recognized the fragility in Shade's condition, a kind of shared struggle that both of them understood all too well. With a tentative step forward, Kale made a quiet sound, an unspoken offering of peace. The raven, though wary, seemed to understand. Its beady eyes locked onto Kale's, and for a brief moment, there was a shared recognition between them. It wasn't trust, no, not yet, but it was something else, a kind of agreement. In the days that followed, the unlikely pair became something of a team. Shade, though weakened, began to guide Kale to food sources. The raven, in return for Kale's protection, led him to hidden berry bushes, streams teeming with fish, and even the occasional carcass left by another predator. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them both. In exchange, Kale became Shade's protector. He would ward off any predators that threatened the raven, using his size and strength to keep the smaller creature safe. The balance they struck was delicate but effective. Kyle knew that the raven's guidance had saved him more than once, and Shade had come to rely on Kyle's protection. Together, they navigated the wilderness, an odd but effective team. Kale's days, which had once been filled with the weight of loneliness and survival, were now filled with purpose and companionship. The bond they shared, though still new and fragile, was a light in the dark forest. Shade's sharp eyes and quick wit complemented Kyle's strength and perseverance, and for the first time since the storm, Kyle felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, a bear and a raven, an unlikely pairing in a world where survival was the only true measure of worth. But for Kyle, it was everything. The once agonizing days of solitude had been replaced with moments of shared purpose. And the forest, which had once felt like a cold and indifferent place, now seemed just a little bit warmer. Together, Kyle and Shade found a rhythm, an understanding that was built on mutual need, trust, and the shared experience of navigating a world that wasn't made for either of them. In the end, Kyle had learned something invaluable, that sometimes the most unlikely of friendships can be the ones that make all the difference. With every passing day, the air grew colder, the warmth of the sun retreating further with each dusk. The forest, once vibrant with the noise of summer, was growing quiet, the leaves turning brown and crisp underfoot. Kale could feel it, the change in the air, the shift that signaled winter was coming. His fur, once sleek and summer soft, was beginning to thicken, and his instincts, honed through the struggle of his survival, were telling him that the stakes were higher than ever. Winter for a grizzly meant a fight against the elements, a time of scarcity and solitude. Bears were not built to thrive during the long, frigid months, but rather to endure them. The process of hibernation was a delicate balance, one that depended heavily on the food they had consumed during the warmer months. A bear's survival through winter depended on its ability to build fat reserves in preparation for the long sleep. These reserves would be its fuel for the months ahead, when food would be scarce and the harsh cold would sap every ounce of energy. Cal, however, was still small, smaller than most bears his age. His bones had yet to fully harden, and his body was still growing. His fur, though thickening, was not yet the dense coat of an adult bear. His muscles were not yet as powerful, his instincts not yet as sharp as those of a seasoned grizzly. And yet the urgency of the situation was clear. The clock was ticking. If he did not find enough food soon, he would not survive the winter. Shade had been a constant companion, guiding Kale through the forest, leading him to the last remnants of berries, the roots that had survived the dry months. Together they had scraped by. But with each passing day, the challenges grew more daunting. The forest was becoming barren, the sweet taste of berries and the abundance of edible roots fading with the cold winds. Shade's sharp eyes continued to spot scraps, but they were few and far between. Kyle's hunger was growing, his energy waning, and with winter fast approaching, every meal, every bite of food, was more precious than the last. Then one day, Kyle stumbled upon something that made his heart race, a salmon run. The sight of the rushing water, teeming with fish, was a bear's dream. The river was swollen with salmon, their bright red bodies darting through the current, desperate to reach their spawning grounds. Kale's instincts flared. He knew that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, an opportunity to gorge on the fatty, nutrient-rich fish that would fuel him for the long winter ahead. His mouth watered as he watched the fish, his stomach growling in hunger. But as Kale moved closer, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the air. His heart sank as he looked up to see another grizzly bear, much larger and older than him, standing near the riverbank. The bear's fur was thick and glossy, its muscles rippling with the power of an experienced predator. It was a magnificent creature, but to Kale it was a formidable threat, a reminder of how far he still had to go to be able to claim his place in this world. The older bear's eyes were locked onto Kale, its stance aggressive. It was clear that this salmon run had been claimed. This was the older bear's territory. Kale knew immediately that he stood no chance. His body was small, his experience limited, and the larger grizzly's growl made it clear that any attempt to claim the fish would lead to a dangerous confrontation. Kale hesitated for a moment, his hunger urging him to fight, but his survival instincts took over. He had learned the hard way that there was no shame in retreating when your life was at stake. With a heavy heart, he turned and began to walk away, the growl of his stomach a bitter reminder of his vulnerability. The older Grizzly watched him leave, its dominance in the territory unchallenged. Kyle's head hung low, his body aching from the struggle, but he knew he had made the right choice. The salmon would have to wait. The forest seemed quieter now. The thrill of the salmon run, so close and yet out of reach, left a bitter taste in Kale's mouth. He had come so close and yet he had nothing. He was reminded once again of how unforgiving this world could be, how despite his determination and strength, there were always forces beyond his control. Winter was coming and Kale's time was running out. Just when hope seemed lost and Kale's spirit began to wane, Shade, the raven who had become his unlikely companion, led him to a place that Cal had never dreamed of, a hidden valley tucked deep within the forest. It was a place untouched by the harshness of the world outside, a sanctuary that seemed to be carved from the earth just for him. The air was warmer here, the sun streaming through the canopy, casting golden light on the valley floor. It was as though the seasons themselves had paused to grant Kyle a reprieve from the struggle he had known for so long. The moment Kyle set foot in the valley, his senses came alive. The scent of wildflowers filled the air, mingling with the earthy fragrance of the moss-covered ground. The valley, nestled between rolling hills, was alive with life, green and full of promise. The soil was rich and fertile, and the plants grew thick and abundant, as though the land itself had been waiting for Kale to find it. As Shade led him through the lush undergrowth, Kale's eyes widened at the sight of the bounty before him. Berries, the kind Kale had spent so many fruitless days searching for, grew in abundance here. Bright blue huckleberries and plump elderberries weighed down the branches, their sweet aroma filling the air. Shade guided him to the clear, cool stream that wound its way through the valley, and Cal watched in awe as schools of fish darted through the water, unaware of the hungry bear's presence. Fish, something Cal had dreamed of in his darkest moments, were now a constant companion in this paradise. And there, nestled in the crook of a nearby tree, Cal discovered something even more unexpected. Honeycombs. The golden nectar glistened under the sunlight, the sweet fragrance drawing Cal toward it. He couldn't believe his luck. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, food was no longer a scarcity. It was abundant, ready and waiting for him. For the first time, Kyle felt the deep, steady pull of contentment in his stomach. With the resources at his disposal, Kyle set about making the valley his home. He found a small, secluded spot beneath a large, ancient tree, its roots reaching deep into the earth, and began to build a den. He gathered dry leaves and thick grasses, weaving them together to create a comfortable, warm shelter. As he worked, he felt his strength returning, his once thin frame filling out with each passing day. The valley, with its serenity and abundance, had become a sanctuary for Cal, a place where he could finally take a breath and prepare for the challenges of the coming winter. Days turned into weeks, and Cal grew stronger, his fur thickening against the approaching cold. He learned the rhythms of the valley, how the seasons here flowed differently from the outside world. The wind was gentler, the trees more steadfast, and the river's song became a lullaby he welcomed each night. He no longer felt alone or vulnerable. The valley gave him what he had been searching for all this time, a sense of belonging. This place, hidden away from the rest of the world, was where Kyle could truly be himself, a bear growing into his strength, a survivor with the will to thrive. For the first time since he had been separated from his family, Kale felt the comforting weight of peace settle on him. He could hear the birds singing in the trees, feel the warmth of the sun on his back, and know that no matter what lay ahead, he had found a place that was truly his. The hidden valley had given him not just food, shelter, and strength, but the hope to believe in tomorrow. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings, and Cal, now larger and stronger than ever, emerged from his den to witness the world come alive around him. The once barren trees had begun to bud, the air was filled with the sweet scent of fresh blossoms, and the valley's stream had come to life with the rush of meltwater from the mountains above. Kyle's body was stronger now, his muscles rippling beneath the thick, glossy fur that had grown in the warmth of the valley's sanctuary. As the season changed, something deep inside Kale stirred. A pull, a longing for something more. His memory of his family, of his mother's comforting presence, began to flood his mind. The scent of his mother's fur, the sound of his siblings' laughter, the warmth of the family they once shared. These memories were sharp, vivid, and they beckoned Cale forward. He had grown in the solitude of the valley, but now, with spring on the horizon, the time had come for him to face the next step of his journey, to find his family. The search would be arduous, and the wilderness was no longer a safe, nurturing place. Fires, floods, and predators had claimed their share of the forest, and Cale knew the dangers he would face in his search. But the fire in his heart, the strength that had been nourished in the hidden valley, pushed him forward. With shade now flying by his side, Cale followed his memories, sniffing the air, tracing old scents that still lingered in the earth. The path was long and treacherous, and at times Cale thought he had gone too far, that perhaps he would never find them. Yet there was always something that urged him on, some faint glimmer of hope that kept him moving forward. Then one day, as the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him, Cale heard it, a sound he had longed to hear for what seemed like an eternity. A roar, familiar, strong, and unmistakably his mother's. The rush of emotions overwhelmed him, joy, relief, hope surging through his veins. He ran toward the sound, following the trail that his heart had led him on. As he pushed through the underbrush, Cale's eyes landed on a sight that filled him with wonder. His mother. There, standing strong in the face of danger, was his mother, a towering figure of power and protection. She was not alone. His siblings were with her, their eyes wide with recognition as they saw Cale for the first time in so long. The reunion was brief but powerful, an emotional rush that filled Cale's chest with pride and love. His family had not forgotten him, and the love that bound them together was stronger than any obstacle they had faced. But the moment was fleeting. As they reunited, a wildfire began to rage in the distance, smoke billowing through the trees, the flames spreading quickly. Cale's family was in danger. Without hesitation, Cale stepped forward, his newfound strength surging through his limbs. With a roar of determination, he led his family through the chaos, guiding them to safety, his heart swelling with the courage that only love could provide. The fire could not stop them. Not now, not after all they had been through. Cale stood at the edge of the forest, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to set over the Alaskan wilderness. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but Cale had emerged victorious. The wilderness had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but it had also shaped him into something stronger, something greater. No longer the lost cub who had once wandered alone, Cale had become a symbol of resilience. His story was not just a tale of survival, it was a testament to the strength found in even the smallest hearts, the determination to fight against all odds. The wilderness had tried to break him, but it had only made him stronger. Through the storms, the loneliness, and the dangers that lurked at every turn, Cale had found his place in the world. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting a warm glow across the valley he now called home, Cale felt the weight of his journey settle within him. His path had been one of hardship, but also one of growth, of learning the deep, unspoken language of the wild. The echoes of the wilderness had become his own, and in them he had found his purpose. Cale knew that his journey was far from over. The world was vast, and there were still many challenges ahead. But as he stood there, his family by his side, the winds of the wild whispering through the trees, he understood one thing. He was no longer a cub lost in the dark. He was a survivor, and the wild was his home.